A boy stepped out of the car with his only blanket in hands, shivering as he placed it over the homeless man on the sidewalk, while his father, with tears in his eyes, wondered how they could continue their journey now. As the icy wind cut through the night, the father looked at the boy and the homeless man, torn between pride for the act of compassion and fear that this simple gesture could put his family at risk. Little did they know that this seemingly small decision would mark the beginning of a journey that would change their lives forever. The cold sliced like blades as the old car creaked under the weight of the snowy road. Inside, Harrison kept his hands tense on the steering wheel, his eyes squinting at a distant point in the darkness. Beside him, Eleanor fiddled with the buttons of the car heater that had long stopped working, trying to distract herself from the palpable tension. In the back seat, Thomas clutched his lucky blanket to his chest, feeling the heavy silence that hung between his parents. "We need to conserve fuel, Eleanor. We can't keep making detours," Harrison said, his voice laden with exhaustion. Eleanor sighed, her worried gaze shifting to the speedometer, which read just over a quarter of a tank. "I know, but we can't spend New Year's Eve on the road." Thomas, with his childlike curiosity, broke the silence. "Mom, where are we going again?" "To Aunt Agatha's house," Eleanor replied with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "She'll help us until things get better." Harrison let out a small sigh of irritation, his fingers drumming on the steering wheel. He didn't want to depend on anyone, especially not a distant aunt, but options were scarce. Ever since he lost his job, it felt like life was crumbling at a pace he couldn't keep up with. As the minutes passed, the snow began to fall more heavily, forming a white blanket on the pavement. The town of Rosemore seemed like a portrait of abandonment: closed shops, dusty windows with outdated sale signs, and streetlights flickering as if they were on the verge of giving up. It wasn't a scene for celebrating New Year's, but a cruel reminder of what the economic crisis had wrought on places like this. Thomas pressed his face against the frozen window, watching the shadows outside. That was when he saw him. A man huddled against the wall of an abandoned building, shivering from the cold beneath a thin pile of newspapers. His face was barely visible beneath a dirty hood, but his condition was undeniable. Thomas furrowed his brow, feeling something he couldn't quite describe, a tightness in his small heart. "Dad, there's someone out there!" Thomas shouted, pointing at the man. "Thomas, sit down!" Harrison's voice sounded harsh, but the boy didn't hear him. Before his parents could react, he opened the car door and ran toward the stranger. "Thomas, come back here right now!" Harrison yelled, rushing out of the car. Eleanor held her breath as she watched her husband chase after their son, the icy wind blowing into the empty car. Outside, Thomas knelt beside the man. He seemed ageless, his skin marked by life on the streets, but his eyes were lively, albeit visibly tired. Thomas took off his blanket and stretched it out to the man without a second thought. "Hey, sir, are you cold? You can have this," the boy said, his innocence cutting through the harshness of the night. The man slowly lifted his gaze, surprised by the gesture. "Thank you, kid," he murmured, his voice hoarse and broken. "Thomas, what do you think you're doing?" Harrison reached him, pulling his son by the arm. "Get back in the car right now!" "But Dad, he's cold. He needs it more than I do." "Thomas, get in the car. We don't have time for this," Harrison shouted, his patience wearing thin. He didn't want to be cruel, but he was on edge. All he could think about was the dwindling fuel and the weight of the responsibilities he carried. "Let the boy be, Harrison," Eleanor's voice came from behind him. She had stepped out of the car to check on the situation, and as she looked at the man, something in her heart broke. "He's right. We can't just leave him here." Harrison turned to her, incredulous. "Eleanor, we barely have enough for ourselves. What do you want me to do? Take a stranger in our old car with the tank almost empty?" "If we don't do something, he's going to freeze," Eleanor said, her voice firm. Thomas looked at his father, his big eyes filled with determination. "Please, Dad, just until we find him a place." Harrison felt cornered. He glanced at the man, who could barely stay seated, then back at his son's pleading face. The cold was biting, but not as much as the guilt that began to invade his heart. Finally, he relented. "Okay, we'll take him to the shelter, but that's it." His voice was firm, but there was a tone of resignation. Thomas smiled as he helped the man to his feet. Eleanor held the stranger's other arm, guiding him to the car. Harrison watched the scene with a mix of frustration and something he couldn't name. It was a weight, something that troubled him more than he would like to admit. Back in the car, the silence was cutting. The man sat in the seat next to Thomas, clutching the blanket like it was a treasure. "Thank you," he murmured again, but no one replied. Harrison started the car, trying to ignore the fuel gauge, which was now flashing with warning. He knew that this decision would complicate things, but he had no energy left to argue. "What's your name?" Thomas asked, his excited voice breaking the silence. "Bennett," the man replied without looking up. "Do you live here?" the boy insisted. "Not anymore. I used to, but not anymore." His voice sounded distant, almost as if he were talking to himself. Eleanor shot a glance at Harrison, who kept his eyes fixed on the road. Something about that man felt familiar, but he couldn't pinpoint what it was. Perhaps it was just fatigue or the tension of the situation, but he felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. As the car moved slowly through the deserted streets of Rosemore, the snowflakes danced under the weak light of the streetlights. The fuel gauge was dropping dangerously low, and Harrison knew that time was running out. But at that moment, all he could do was keep moving forward, even though he wasn't sure where to. When the car stopped at a traffic light, Bennett murmured something that caught Harrison's attention. "I've taught many kids. I was good at it, but I lost everything." Harrison looked in the rearview mirror, his heart racing. Those words echoed with a distant resonance, a memory he couldn't quite grasp. He opened his mouth to ask, but hesitated. This wasn't the time for that, or maybe he was afraid of the answer. "We're almost there," Eleanor said, trying to ease the tension. But the truth was, no one really knew where there would be. When the traffic light turned green, Harrison accelerated. His mind was a storm of doubts, but one thing was certain. That night, something was changing. He just didn't know how much. The distant sound of fireworks announced the approach of the new year, but for Harrison, Eleanor, and Thomas, it felt like the world around them was frozen in time, caught in the uncertainty of what lay ahead. And in the back seat, Bennett held Thomas's blanket like it was a thread of hope, murmuring something inaudible. Harrison glanced at the fuel gauge once more. He knew there wasn't much time left before the tank ran dry. Deep down, a question he tried to avoid echoed in his mind. Who was Bennett, and why did those words sound so familiar? The snow fell heavily as Harrison drove the car up to the entrance of the community shelter. Dim lights illuminated the facade of the worn building, and the line stretching out the door was a clear sign that the place was overwhelmed. Harrison sighed, exhausted, while Thomas and Eleanor looked at the location with a mix of hope and apprehension. "Let's hurry," Harrison murmured, turning off the car and casting a worried glance at the nearly empty fuel gauge. "We can't waste any more time." Thomas pressed his hands against the glass, watching the people waiting in line. Faces marked by the cold, hardships, and stories he couldn't know but imagined were sad. "Why are there so many people here, Mom?" he asked softly, his voice heavy with curiosity and a hint of fear. Eleanor stroked her son's hair. "They're people who need help, dear, like Mr. Bennett." Harrison opened the door, the sound of the cold wind filling the car. "Stay here while I sort this out." He walked over to Bennett, who seemed lost in his own world, and helped the man out of the car. Bennett swayed slightly, as if all strength had completely abandoned him. The blanket Thomas had given him was his only protection against the relentless cold. As they entered the shelter, the scene was even more desolate than expected. The strong smell of damp clothes and cheap coffee filled the air. People huddled in corners, some wrapped in thin blankets, others whispering as they clutched disposable cups. A staff member, his face etched with fatigue, was behind a counter, typing something on an old computer. "Excuse me," Harrison said, his voice weighted with firmness but also exhaustion. "This man needs help. He can't spend the night outside." The staff member slowly lifted his eyes, as if this were the 1,000th time he had heard something like that night. "We're full. There's no space." "You don't understand." Harrison looked at Bennett, who could barely stand. "He won't survive out there. Any corner will do, just a place where he can stay warm." The man sighed, rubbing his temples. "Sir, I really wish I could help, but we're beyond capacity. It's not a matter of choice. We have nowhere to put him." Eleanor, who had entered with Thomas right behind her, stepped forward. "Please," she said, her voice softer, but filled with urgency. "We have a child here, and he's seen what this man is facing. What do you expect us to do? Just let him freeze?" Thomas, with wide eyes full of concern, looked at the staff member. "He's good. I gave him my blanket. Please help." The staff member averted his gaze from Thomas, visibly uncomfortable. "I'm sorry, but I can't create space where there isn't any." At that moment, Bennett stumbled and fell to his knees. Harrison quickly caught him, the cold of Bennett's skin shocking him. "This is madness!" he exclaimed, his voice echoing through the hall. "You can't just send us away!" People around them stopped and looked at the scene. Some with pity, others with empty stares, accustomed to this kind of despair. An elderly woman in one corner murmured something about how the shelter was getting worse each winter, and a younger man simply shook his head, resigned. Eleanor placed her hand on Harrison's shoulder, trying to calm him. "Harrison, we need to decide. We can't leave him like this." Harrison felt the weight of the moment, as if the world were collapsing around him. He looked at Thomas, who was watching him with such high expectations that it hurt. He knew that this decision would be etched in their memories, not just for Bennett, but for his own son as well. "All right," Harrison murmured, his jaw tense. "Let's go." Eleanor and Thomas helped Bennett to his feet, guiding him back to the car while Harrison exited the building without looking back. The cold felt even more intense as they reached the vehicle. Harrison slammed the door and waited for everyone to get in before starting the engine. The fuel gauge flickered once more, a cruel reminder of their vulnerability. "What are we going to do now?" Eleanor asked, looking at Harrison with concern. "We keep going to Aunt Agatha's house," Harrison replied tersely. "It's our only option." Silence filled the car as they drove along the road. The snow seemed heavier, and the city lights faded as they entered more isolated areas. Bennett, sitting in the back seat, was motionless except for a slight tremor. Thomas watched him closely, as if he wanted to ensure he was all right. Suddenly, Bennett murmured something. His voice was weak but clear enough for Harrison to hear. "There was a room full of children. I taught books, poems, until I lost everything." A chill ran down Harrison's spine, one that had nothing to do with the winter cold. He glanced at Bennett in the rearview mirror, trying to catch more of what he was saying, but the man had closed his eyes again, exhausted. "Did you hear that?" Eleanor asked, her curiosity piqued. "Yes," Harrison replied, his voice lower, "but it doesn't matter right now." As the car slowly moved along the slippery road, Harrison couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Or maybe too right. He tried to push the thoughts away, but Bennett's words echoed in his mind. Books, poems. Why did that seem so familiar? The car jolted slightly as it hit a hidden pothole under the snow. Thomas clutched Eleanor's arm, frightened, but she quickly reassured him. "It's okay, sweetheart. Your dad knows what he's doing." Harrison, however, wasn't so sure. He glanced at the fuel gauge again, knowing they were nearing empty. Aunt Agatha's house was still many miles away, and the tank seemed unwilling to cooperate. Suddenly, Bennett spoke again, his voice a bit clearer this time. "I used to teach at the Central School of Rosemore, until—" Harrison gripped the steering wheel tightly. The Central School of Rosemore. That brought back memories he preferred to keep buried. He had studied there as a young man before life pushed him into the factory and took him away from his dream of being a teacher, but it could just be a coincidence. Bennett was just a lost man, murmuring disjointed things, right? "Are you okay, Harrison?" Eleanor asked, noticing her husband's tense expression. "I am," he lied, looking away. Thomas looked at Bennett with curiosity. "Did you teach kids like me?" Bennett opened his eyes slightly, a faint smile appearing on his lips. "Yes, I taught many curious boys, like you." The comment made Harrison swallow hard. He tried to ignore it, focusing on the road ahead. But Bennett's words continued to echo, bringing back memories of simpler times, of a young Harrison who believed he could change the world with poetry and knowledge. The car began to slow down, a low groan coming from the engine. Harrison closed his eyes for a moment, knowing that meant trouble. "We're out of gas," he finally said, his voice filled with frustration. Eleanor looked at him alarmed. "And now, what are we going to do?" Harrison had no answer. He pulled the car over to the side of the road, letting the engine die completely. Darkness and silence fell over them like a weight. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the world with a layer of relentless cold. Inside the car, the air felt heavier. Bennett was motionless again, as if the energy to fight had finally drained from him. Thomas held Eleanor's arm, looking at his dad with expectation. Harrison let out a heavy sigh. He knew he had to do something, but felt all options were closed off. Then he looked at the rear-view mirror once more, his eyes fixed on Bennett. Who was that man really? And why did it seem fate had brought them together that night? He opened the car door, the cold wind hitting him immediately. "Stay here," he said, his voice firm. "I'm going to look for help." As he walked down the dark road, Harrison couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to that night than he could comprehend. He needed to find a way to save his family and Bennett, but deep down, he knew that this journey was just beginning. In the distance, he saw a faint light, perhaps from a house or a small shop. His heart raced and he quickened his steps, ignoring the biting cold. But as he got closer, something in the back of his mind told him that light wouldn't be the solution to all his problems, but the beginning of a new series of questions and revelations.
If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and share your thoughts in the comments below. It really helps the channel grow and reach more people with these powerful stories. Thank you for your support. Now let's continue the story.
The snow was falling harder, covering the road in a treacherous layer that made every meter a challenge. Harrison moved slowly, the sound of the engine resonating like a groan, accompanied by the unsettling creak of the car that seemed to share the fatigue of its occupants. The silence between them was thick, broken only by the wind whistling outside and the short, controlled breaths of Eleanor, who was trying to manage her evident worry. In the back seat, Thomas huddled, hugging his knees as he gazed out the frozen window. He was restless but held back the urge to ask questions. He sensed that something was wrong but didn't want to add to the weight on his parents' faces. "Would you like to hear a story, dear?" Eleanor asked, turning slightly to Thomas, trying to distract him. Her voice had a forced sweetness, as if she were trying to contain the fear that was beginning to overflow. Thomas hesitated before nodding. "Maybe, but it has to have a happy ending." Eleanor smiled, but her eyes were filled with tears she quickly hid. Of course, dear. Let's see. Once upon a time there was a family traveling through a very cold place, just like us now. They were lost, but together they found a way. As Eleanor wove her improvised tale, Harrison kept his eyes fixed on the road. He couldn't afford to be distracted. The fuel gauge was still blinking, and the snow continued to fall as if it wanted to swallow everything around them. Every moment felt like a struggle against time and fate. "This isn't going to work for much longer," Harrison murmured, almost to himself, but loud enough for Eleanor to hear. "The car is on its last legs, the fuel is going to run out, and we are alone." Eleanor paused her story for a moment and looked at her husband. "Harrison, stop thinking the worst. We'll find a way. We always do." "It's not that simple," he replied, not taking his eyes off the road. "I'm tired of always having to find a way, tired of failing, tired of depending on others." His voice became graver, laden with frustration and despair. "I've already lost everything. You know that. Now we're heading to my aunt's house as if we're a burden. Do you think this is easy for me?" "Harrison," Eleanor began, but he cut her off. "No! I should be able to take care of you both. I should be able to provide a better life for Thomas, for you. But here we are, lost, out of money, aimless, and with a stranger in the back seat." Bennett, who had been quiet until then, shifted slightly but said nothing. Eleanor shot Harrison a disapproving glance but chose not to argue. "I understand how you feel, but blaming yourself isn't going to get us anywhere. We need to have hope, even if it seems impossible." Harrison let out a heavy sigh and ran a hand over his face. He knew Eleanor was right, but it didn't lessen the weight he carried. "Hope doesn't fill the gas tank, Eleanor," he murmured, almost inaudibly. The car creaked again, and Harrison slowed down. They were entering an even more deserted area. The road seemed endless, as if leading them to nowhere. The only visible thing was the weak reflection of the taillights on the snow. Suddenly, the engine made a strange sound and died completely. The silence that followed was deafening. Harrison gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white. "What happened?" Thomas asked, his voice laced with worry. "Eleanor, try to keep him calm," Harrison said, attempting to sound confident as he turned the key in the ignition. The engine made a noise, but it wouldn't start. "It's okay, Thomas," Eleanor said, though her tone belied her words. "Your dad is going to fix it." Harrison tried again, but the car remained inert. He leaned forward, resting his forehead against the steering wheel. His mind was flooded with memories of the last time he felt this way. Powerless, unable to control his own life. It was like the day he was fired from the factory, the manager saying coldly that they no longer needed him. Now the same feeling of failure was there, suffocating. "It's going to work," he murmured to himself, turning the key once more. Before he could try again, Bennett murmured something from the back seat. His voice was weak but clear enough to be heard. "I taught so many boys. They had dreams. Big dreams. One of them, he loved books, poems, always with a notebook in hand." Harrison froze. He turned slowly to face Bennett. "What are you talking about?" Bennett looked at him, his eyes seeming more alive for a brief moment. A boy. He believed he could change the world with words. Eleanor glanced at Bennett and then back at Harrison, who now seemed completely paralyzed. Something about those words stirred him in a way he didn't fully understand. "What are you saying, Bennett?" Harrison insisted, his voice sounding harsher than he intended, but Bennett simply closed his eyes again, as if too exhausted to continue. Harrison took a deep breath, trying to push away the whirlwind of emotions brewing in his mind. He turned the key once more, and miraculously, the engine roared back to life. A collective sigh filled the car, but the tension remained. "By some miracle, we're still running," Harrison said, adjusting the steering wheel and resuming their journey. "But we don't know for how long." The car moved forward, but the silence inside was thicker than before. Harrison was restless. Bennett's words continued to echo in his mind. He was sure he had heard something like that before, but couldn't remember where. It felt like a puzzle whose pieces were scattered. Eleanor, sitting beside him, watched Bennett through the rearview mirror. There was something in his gaze that seemed both grateful and deeply sad, as if he were carrying a burden that no one else could see. She wondered what could have happened to bring that man to such a desperate state. "Are you okay, Harrison?" she asked, breaking the silence. "No," he replied without hesitation, his voice low and tense, "but I'll pretend I am." The road stretched on, long and desolate, and the snow showed no signs of letting up. Every kilometer felt like another test of endurance for both the car and the family. Harrison glanced at the fuel gauge again. The light was still blinking, a constant reminder that time was running out. As the car continued, Eleanor tried to talk to Thomas, but he was quiet, lost in his own thoughts. He watched Bennett, trying to understand what made that man so significant to his parents. Even without knowing, he felt that something big was happening. The engine made another noise and Harrison held his breath. But this time, the car kept going, as if it were fighting to move forward. Eleanor reached out and gently touched Harrison's arm. "It's going to be okay," she said, though she knew he didn't believe it. Not long after, Bennett spoke again, his voice sounding like a whisper in the wind. The boy. He wanted to be someone. He believed. Harrison looked in the rearview mirror, his heart racing. He felt he was on the verge of remembering something, but he didn't know if he was ready to face whatever it was. Bennett met his gaze for a brief moment, then closed his eyes again, as if the effort to speak was too much. The tension in the car was palpable. Eleanor looked at Harrison, who seemed lost in his own thoughts. She wanted to ask what was happening, but she knew this wasn't the moment. Finally, Harrison spotted a sign indicating that a small gas station was a few kilometers ahead. A momentary relief washed over him, but a growing concern followed. Would there be enough fuel to get there? "Let's stop at the gas station," he said, his voice filled with determination. "Hopefully we can refuel and continue our journey." Eleanor nodded, holding Thomas's hand as the car moved slowly onward. The gas station was their only hope at that moment, but deep down, they all knew the journey was far from over. As the faint light of the gas station appeared in the distance, a mix of relief and apprehension washed over them. Harrison adjusted the steering wheel, taking a deep breath. But as the car drew closer, he couldn't shake the feeling that something else awaited them, something that would completely change the course of that night. The constant hum of the engine and the soft creaking of the car were the only sounds filling the cold night. The faint light from the gas station had long disappeared over the horizon as the vehicle continued down the deserted road. The fuel gauge flickered like a countdown, but for now, the car still moved. Inside, silence reigned. Thomas had fallen asleep, his head resting on Eleanor's shoulder, who had also closed her eyes, exhausted from hours of tension. Harrison, alone in his vigil, kept his hands steady on the wheel. The dark road seemed to stretch infinitely, but his mind was elsewhere. Something in Bennett's words echoed within him, awakening memories he had buried long ago. He found himself back in a time when snow didn't feel so hostile, when he was a young man full of dreams, sitting in the last row of a classroom that smelled of old paper and lukewarm coffee. Harrison recalled the warmth of a notebook in his hands, the glide of a pencil as he scribbled poems that no one but him would ever read. And he remembered the encouragement of a gentle yet firm voice that always made him believe his words could change something. "You have talent, Harrison," the teacher had said, leaning over his desk. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Words have power. Use them." He could see the teacher's face clearly now, a man with an encouraging smile and eyes that seemed to see beyond people's exteriors. He was the only one who believed Harrison could be more than the poor boy growing up in a forgotten neighborhood of Rosemore. Harrison had dreams of becoming a teacher, of sharing his passion for literature with others, but just like the warmth of the notebook, those dreams faded with time. Reality hit him like a crushing weight when his father lost his job, and the responsibility of helping the family fell on Harrison's shoulders. He dropped out of school and took a job at the local factory. At first, he still wrote, hiding his ideas on scraps of paper during breaks. But the factory consumed more than just his hours. It consumed his hope. The poems vanished, and with them, the dream of one-day teaching. Harrison blinked rapidly, brushing away the tears that threatened to surface. The cold wasn't the only reason for the tightness in his chest. He cast a brief glance at the back seat, where Bennett lay quiet, still wrapped in Thomas's blanket. The words the man had murmured earlier, about teaching, about a boy who believed in words, seemed to dig deep into his heart. As the road continued to pass beneath the car's wheels, Harrison felt a slight tremor in the dashboard. A yellow light blinked, indicating that fuel was running low. He let out a heavy sigh, feeling the weight of responsibility increase. He needed to make a decision, and quickly. Looking ahead, he saw a fork in the road leading to a secondary route. A poorly lit sign indicated a gas station a few miles down that way. It was a risk, but the only chance to keep going. "Eleanor!" he called, his voice low so as not to wake Thomas. She opened her eyes slowly, blinking against the dim light of the dashboard. "What is it?" she asked, already sensing the worry in his tone. "We have to leave the main road. There's a gas station on the secondary route, but I don't know if the fuel will last." She looked at him, assessing his expression. "Are you sure it's safe?" "We have no other choice," Harrison replied, steering onto the narrower road. The path seemed even tighter, flanked by trees that rose like sentinels under the weight of the accumulated snow. In the silence that followed, a faint sound came from the back seat. Bennett opened his eyes, his irregular breathing visible in the cold air of the car. He looked directly at Harrison, his lips moving with difficulty. "Boy, Wordsworth," he murmured, the word escaping with effort. Harrison felt his blood run cold. It was a nickname he hadn't heard in decades, something that special teacher had called him. "How do you know that?" he asked, turning to face Bennett in the rearview mirror. Bennett didn't respond immediately, his head tilting slightly to the side. Harrison turned his eyes back to the road, but his mind was spinning. Could it be possible? This broken man in the back seat was the same teacher who had inspired him so much in the past? How had he ended up here? Eleanor noticed the change in Harrison's demeanor and frowned. "What did he say, Harrison? What's going on?" "It's nothing," Harrison lied, but his voice betrayed the confusion within. The snow began to fall more heavily, reducing visibility to almost zero. The car's headlights struggled to illuminate the path ahead, but everything seemed to blur into a white haze. Harrison tightened his grip on the wheel, trying to maintain control. "This road is worse than I thought," he murmured, more to himself than to Eleanor. The car skidded slightly, and Eleanor instinctively grabbed Thomas's arm, even though he was still asleep. "Harrison, maybe we should stop. We can't take that risk." "And get stuck here?" Harrison retorted, frustration evident in his voice. "The gas station is just ahead. We just need to get there." Bennett murmured something again, but it was inaudible. Eleanor watched him, her eyes filled with concern. There was something in Bennett's gaze, even in his weakened state, that deeply unsettled her. It was as if he wanted to say something important, but couldn't find the strength. Finally, in the distance, Harrison spotted a sign indicating the gas station. But the snowstorm tightened even further, turning every meter into a battle. He knew they were at the limit, both with fuel and their own strength. "Just a little more," he murmured, as if trying to persuade the car not to give up. As the faint light of the gas station appeared, a mixture of relief and concern washed over Harrison. It was his chance to refuel and continue, but something about that night told him the answers he sought wouldn't end there. As the car slowly approached, Harrison couldn't help but wonder, what else did Bennett know, and how could those forgotten words change everything? The car crept slowly along the snow-covered road, the weak light from the gas station approaching like a timid beacon in the midst of darkness. The relief of finally reaching that point was immediate, but Harrison felt a growing unease. The snowstorm was intensifying, and something deep in his mind told him that the journey was far from over. As he parked near the pumps, he noticed the precariousness of the place. The station appeared abandoned, with rusty signs swaying in the strong wind and windows fogged up from years of neglect. An old, flickering sign blinked intermittently, as if it were on the verge of going out for good. Inside, a hunched figure emerged from behind the counter, an elderly man with a face weathered by time, wearing a worn coat and a hat that had seen better days. Harrison turned off the engine, glancing at the fuel gauge now completely empty. "Stay here," he said, opening the door and braving the biting cold. Eleanor followed him before he could protest, pulling her coat tighter around herself. "I need something warm for Thomas," she justified, "and you need fuel." Thomas, still drowsy, remained in the car, wrapped in the blanket that now covered Bennett, watching with tired eyes as his parents moved away. He said nothing, but his small fingers clutched the fabric as if it were an anchor of comfort. Harrison pushed open the station door, and a weak bell announced his entrance. The warmth inside was almost non-existent, and the smell of aged wood mingled with burnt coffee. The attendant, who looked more like a relic of the place, slowly lifted his eyes, frowning at the unexpected visitor. "I need fuel," Harrison said bluntly, rubbing his hands to ward off the cold. "And fast." The old man, who introduced himself as Mr. Calhoun, chuckled humorlessly, gesturing toward the pump outside. "You're lucky to still have something to pump. We're at the end of our stock." "How much do you have?" Harrison asked, irritation creeping into his voice. "Enough for half a trip, maybe," Mr. Calhoun replied, turning back to an old newspaper on the counter. "This storm has complicated everything. Deliveries have been delayed for days." Eleanor walked over to a small stove in the corner, where a few cups of cheap coffee waited in a worn pot. She filled 2 disposable cups, handing one to Harrison while taking another for Bennett. "This will help," she said, more to herself than anyone else. Harrison looked around as he waited. The place was a time capsule, with faded posters covering the walls, advertising gasoline promotions from decades ago. A particular poster caught his eye. A teacher's strike that had occurred many years prior, with protest phrases written in large letters. He moved closer, frowning as he read the words, "No education, no future." A distant memory poked at his mind, but before he could process it, Eleanor returned to the car with the coffee for Bennett. Harrison followed, feeling the cold wind slice through him once more. Inside the car, Eleanor handed the cup to Bennett, who held it with trembling hands. He pulled off his hood, revealing for the first time his entire face under the weak light of the station. Harrison froze in place. He knew that face. "Howard Bennett?" The question came out as an incredulous whisper. Bennett slowly raised his eyes, blinking a few times before nodding. "Yes," he said, his voice still hoarse. "And you, Wordsworth?" Harrison recoiled as if he had been struck. The word hit something deep within him, a connection he hadn't known he was waiting for. It was impossible to ignore now. Bennett, his former literature teacher, the man who had sparked his love for words, was there, broken and lost. "How is this possible?" Harrison murmured, his voice heavy with emotion. "What happened to you?" Bennett took a few seconds to reply, as if each word was a monumental effort. "Life happened," he said, staring at the cup in his hands. "After years of teaching, the cuts came. I lost my job, and with it everything that mattered. My family, I couldn't support them. I lost my home, and then I lost myself." Harrison felt a knot tighten in his throat. He wanted to speak, but the words felt trapped. At the same time, anger and compassion wrestled within him. How had the man who had inspired him so much come to this point? He saw a reflection of his own fears in that aged face. The possibility that despite his efforts, he too could completely fail. "Eleanor, did you know about this?" he asked, turning to his wife. But she simply shook her head, surprised by the revelation. Thomas, who had been quietly observing the conversation, finally spoke. "He was your teacher, Daddy." Harrison nodded slowly, not taking his eyes off Bennett. "He was. He taught me to love books, to write." His voice faltered, and he looked away, trying to process the mountain of emotions. Thomas smiled faintly, despite the heavy atmosphere. "So he's good, Daddy. He helped you be who you are." Thomas's words echoed as a simple yet powerful truth. Harrison closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. He couldn't argue with that, but still he felt the tension in every fiber of his being. "We have to go," Harrison finally said, his voice harsher than he intended. "The fuel won't last long, and the storm is getting worse." He stepped out of the car and began to fill up with the little that was left in the station's tank. The wind howled around him, bringing swirling snowflakes that quickly piled up. Inside the car, Eleanor and Thomas helped Bennett wrap himself tighter in the blanket as he continued to struggle to stay conscious. When the tank was full enough to continue the journey, Harrison returned to the car and started the engine. He glanced at Mr. Calhoun, who stood at the station door, watching the road with a somber expression. "You should wait for the storm to pass," the old man said. "It's not safe out there." "We don't have time to wait," Harrison replied, trying to sound more confident than he felt. Calhoun shrugged. "Then good luck, you're going to need it." Harrison accelerated, guiding the car back onto the secondary road. The silence inside the vehicle was heavy, yet filled with subtext. Each person was lost in their own thoughts, trying to understand what that night meant. The snow fell with increasing intensity, reducing visibility to mere meters. Harrison tightened his grip on the steering wheel, trying to ignore the fear rising within him. Bennett was quiet again, but his presence was a constant reminder of what could happen when life stripped everything away from someone. Finally, Eleanor broke the silence. "Harrison, are you okay?" "I am," he replied, even though he knew it was a lie. "Just trying to get us to Aunt Agatha's house." But deep down, he knew there was more to it than that. What Bennett represented was something he couldn't ignore: the weight of choices, the fear of failure, and the possibility of redemption. As the car pressed on through the blizzard, Harrison couldn't help but wonder, was it too late to correct the course, for both him and Bennett? The storm ahead seemed more than just a physical challenge. It was a reflection of the battle he faced within himself. The storm advanced relentlessly, covering the road with an ever-thickening layer of snow. The windshield wipers moved frantically, but they were almost useless against the white whirlwind that engulfed everything around. Harrison gripped the steering wheel tightly, his eyes fixed on the little he could see ahead. Every meter traveled was a precarious victory. In the back seat, Thomas trembled slightly, even wrapped in his blanket. His wide eyes flickered between the window and Bennett, who seemed more fragile by the minute. "Dad, Mr. Bennett is shaking a lot," he said, his voice quivering. Eleanor turned around, looking at the man slumped in the seat, his pale hands clutching an empty coffee cup. He appeared on the verge of collapse. "Harrison, he's not going to make it like this," she said, concern evident in her voice. "We're almost there," Harrison replied, not taking his eyes off the road. He knew the words were just an attempt to keep everyone calm. In truth, he had no idea how much longer the car would hold up or if they would find shelter. "Almost where, Harrison?" Eleanor asked, her voice tinged with frustration. "This road seems endless, and we're in the middle of nowhere." Harrison took a deep breath, feeling the pressure mount. He had no answers, but he needed to maintain control. There has to be something ahead. We can't stop now. The conversation ceased, but the silence that followed was even more oppressive. Eleanor looked at Thomas, trying to offer comfort, but the boy's gaze reflected the growing fear they all felt. After a few minutes, she broke the silence again. "Harrison, can I ask you something?" "If it's quick," he replied, trying to keep his focus on the road. "Why did you give up being a teacher? You've never talked about that in detail." The question caught him off guard. He hesitated before responding, feeling the weight of the memories that the question brought back. "It wasn't a choice," he finally said. "At the time, my mother got sick. She needed expensive treatments, and my father was unemployed. I was the only one who could help." Eleanor listened in silence, but her expression softened. She knew that Harrison carried more than he let on, and that sacrifice explained a lot about the rigidity he sometimes showed. "Have you ever thought about trying again?" she asked cautiously. Harrison let out a heavy sigh. "I have, yes, but life moved on. The factory offered me a job, and it seemed the most sensible thing at the time. After we started our family, I just couldn't take that risk anymore." Maybe you should reconsider," Eleanor said gently. But before Harrison could respond, the car jolted violently, followed by a metallic sound. He gripped the wheel tightly, trying to maintain control, but the engine died, and the headlights flickered erratically. "No, not now," Harrison murmured, trying to turn the key in the ignition. The engine groaned one last time before falling silent completely. The deserted road was swallowed by the deadly silence of the storm. "Dad, what's happening?" Thomas asked, his voice filled with fear. "It's the car, son," Eleanor said, trying to hide her own worry. "Your dad will fix it." Harrison got out of the vehicle, immediately engulfed by the biting wind. He opened the hood, but it was useless. The cold froze his fingers within seconds, and he knew that any attempt to fix anything there would be futile. Slamming the hood shut, he returned to the car, shivering. "The car won't work," he said, sitting back in the driver's seat. "We're stuck here." The words hung in the air like a sentence. Thomas began to cry silently, burying his face against Eleanor's chest. She hugged him tightly, trying to keep him warm, but her gaze implored Harrison for a solution. In the back seat, Bennett seemed on the verge of losing consciousness. His eyes were half closed, and his breathing was irregular. Harrison knew that if they didn't find help, not only Bennett but all of them could succumb to the cold. Without thinking twice, he took off his jacket and placed it over Bennett, adjusting the blanket to better cover the man. Eleanor looked at him in surprise, but said nothing. She understood that this gesture was more than just an act of kindness. It was an attempt to redeem something within himself. "Stay here," Harrison said as he opened the door again. "I'm going to look for help." "What? You can't go out in that storm!" Eleanor protested, grabbing his arm. "I have no choice," he replied, his voice firm. "I can't let you freeze here." Eleanor wanted to argue, but she knew he was right. Reluctantly releasing his arm, she simply said, "Be careful." Harrison stepped out of the car, closing the door against the wind that threatened to invade the interior. He could barely see ahead, but he began to walk, battling against the snow that piled up around his feet. Each step was a struggle, but he refused to stop. He needed to find something, anything that could save his family. After a few minutes of walking, he spotted a faint light on the horizon. It was a flickering glow, accompanied by pops that he soon recognized. Fireworks. The new year had arrived. For a moment he stood still, watching the sky light up with vibrant colors that contrasted against the surrounding darkness. He felt a pang of hope, but also of despair. Would anyone in that direction be able to help them? Or were these merely fireworks from a distant celebration, unreachable for him and his family? With a heavy heart but unwavering determination, he began to walk toward the glow. Each step felt harder than the last, but he forced himself to continue. As he moved forward, A question echoed in his mind. Will anyone find us here?
This journey is getting intense, isn't it? If you're loving the story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and leave a like and comment to help us grow and share these emotional tales with even more people. Thanks for being here. Let's keep going.
The snow lashed against Harrison's face as he trudged wearily down the deserted road. His feet sank into the white blanket that seemed to swallow him with each step, and his hoarse voice cut through the icy silence as he shouted for help. The wind responded with merciless whistles, drowning out any attempt to be heard. He pressed on, even as the cold seeped through his clothes and froze his skin, driven by the image of his family in the car, vulnerable and desperate. "Someone!" he shouted again, his voice nearly fading into the void. Nothing. Just darkness, snow, and the distant sound of fireworks announcing the arrival of the new year. He could feel his strength waning, but he knew he couldn't stop. In the car, Eleanor did everything she could to keep Thomas and Bennett warm. She held Bennett's hands, rubbing them vigorously, trying to stimulate some circulation. Thomas was curled up in her lap, still shivering, but now more concerned about the state of the man beside him. "Mommy, is Mr. Bennett going to be okay?" the boy asked, his voice trembling. Eleanor looked at Bennett's pale face, his features etched with exhaustion and cold. "He will be okay," she said, her tone firm in an attempt to mask her own doubt. "Your dad will come back with help. We just need to hold on a little longer." As she massaged Bennett's hands, flashes of memories flooded her mind. She remembered simpler days when Harrison was still that young man full of dreams and they were planning a life together. She recalled the birth of Thomas, the moments when, even with so little, they found ways to smile. And now, here they were, trapped on the worst night of their lives, but together. Maybe this is it, she thought, the final proof that we can overcome anything. Outside, Harrison was on the verge of giving up. His legs ached, his lungs burned, and the numbness was starting to take over his body. He paused for a moment, bending over to catch his breath, when something in the distance caught his eye. A flashing light, red and blue. He blinked, thinking his mind might be playing tricks, but then he heard the unmistakable sound of an engine. "Hey!" he shouted, raising his arms and waving them frantically. The light approached, growing stronger, until a police car emerged from the storm, its headlights cutting through the darkness like a lifeline. The vehicle stopped, and 2 police officers quickly got out, shielding themselves from the wind with their hands. "Sir, are you all right?" one of them asked, stepping closer. My family!" Harrison gasped. "They're trapped in the car, on the road! We need help!" The officers exchanged glances and immediately sprang into action. "Get in the car! We'll go get them!" said the other officer, guiding Harrison into the warm vehicle. He felt the heat envelop him as he quickly explained where the car was. The officers activated their sirens and sped down the snow-covered road. When they reached Harrison's vehicle, Eleanor saw the police car lights and held Thomas tighter. "It's Daddy," she said, relieved. The boy let out a deep sigh, and even Bennett, in his weakened state, opened his eyes at the sound of the sirens. The officers approached the car, opening the doors and helping Eleanor and Thomas out first. They offered thermal blankets, carefully wrapping them up before turning their attention to Bennett. "He's weak," Eleanor said, her voice heavy with concern. "We'll take care of him," one of the officers replied. They helped Bennett stand slowly, covering him with another blanket and guiding him to the patrol car. Harrison appeared soon after, shivering from the cold but relieved to be back with them. Thomas ran to him, throwing himself into his arms. "Daddy, you're back," the boy said, sobbing. Harrison held him tightly, saying nothing, just grateful to embrace his son again. "We're taking you to a 24-hour clinic," the officer said. "From there we can call a tow truck and make sure you're safe." Harrison nodded, helping Eleanor and Thomas into the police car. He looked at Bennett, who was slumped in the seat, struggling to breathe, but with a look that seemed more alert. "Thank you," Bennett murmured, his eyes meeting Harrison's for a brief moment. During the ride to the clinic, the silence in the car was filled with a mix of relief and reflection. Harrison glanced at Bennett, sitting next to him, and noticed something different. Despite his fragile appearance, there was a quiet determination in his eyes, as if he still carried a spark of the man who had once inspired so many students. Harrison felt something shift within himself too. He could no longer ignore what that night represented. It was not just a struggle for survival. It was a reminder that even in the worst circumstances, there was hope. He was not alone in his failures, just as Bennett was not alone in his pain. Eleanor, sitting next to Thomas, held her son's hand and whispered, "We'll get through this together." Her words were simple but carried a powerful promise. The night was not over yet, but for the first time in a long while, she felt that the future might not be so bleak. As the police car approached the illuminated clinic, Harrison looked towards the horizon, where the last fireworks still sparkled in the sky. It was a new year, and with it a new chance. He didn't know what awaited him, but he knew that with his family by his side, he was ready to face whatever came next. Aunt Agatha's house appeared in the distance like a beacon of comfort in the cold night. The lights in the windows were glowing, and a trail of smoke rose from the chimney, signaling that the warm embrace awaited inside. For Harrison, that place was a piece of a distant past, a time he hadn't visited in years, ever since life had pulled him away with its responsibilities and disappointments. When the police car stopped in front of the gate, the door of the house swung open. Agatha Whitlow appeared, her eyes wide at the sight of the group getting out of the car. Dressed in a heavy wool coat and a headscarf, she crossed her arms as she waited, her expression a mix of concern and reproach. "Harrison Chapman," she said as he approached, carrying Thomas in his arms, "I was wondering when you would swallow your pride and knock on my door." "Aunt Agatha," he replied, somewhat hesitantly but with a sigh of relief, "I'm sorry to show up like this, with everything." Agatha cast a quick glance at the group. Her eyes landed on Bennett, who could barely stand, supported by Eleanor and one of the officers. "Who's that?" "A friend, someone who needs help," Eleanor rushed to explain before Harrison could complicate matters. "He's weak and needs to rest." Agatha sighed, opening space for everyone to enter. "Come in. It's not exactly a hotel, but I have room for all of you, and hot tea. You all look like you need it more than I do." The warmth of the house enveloped the group as they crossed the threshold. The living room was small but cozy, with old furniture and shelves filled with books that seemed like they had never left. A worn sofa was hastily made into a bed for Bennett, who settled in with Eleanor's help. Agatha handed out extra blankets while eyeing the man with curiosity, but she didn't ask questions. She knew when it was time to hold her tongue. Thomas, now recovered from the cold, began exploring the house. He found a corner filled with memories, framed diplomas on the walls, old photographs, and a stack of dusty books on a side table. "Mom," he called, holding up a book titled *Educating with Heart*. "Grandma Agatha was a teacher?" "I'm not Grandma," Agatha corrected with a light smile. "But yes, I taught. Young people from local churches mostly. It wasn't much, but it was what I could do at the time." Thomas seemed enchanted. "Mr. Bennett was a teacher too, you know," he said, looking at his aunt. "Is that so?" Agatha shot a quick glance at Bennett, who was leaning back on the sofa, holding a cup of tea that Eleanor had given him. "Well, it seems we have more in common than I thought." As Thomas leafed through the books with curiosity, Harrison settled into an armchair near the fireplace, rubbing his hands to regain warmth. He observed Bennett for a moment, noting how much the man seemed more comfortable there, yet still carried an evident weight on his shoulders. "Bennett," Harrison began, his voice low but firm. "I need to understand. What happened? How did you end up at this point?" Bennett slowly lifted his eyes, meeting Harrison's. He seemed hesitant, as if unsure where to begin, but finally sighed. "I don't know if there's just one reason. It's like falling into an avalanche. Everything collapses before you realize it." He continued, his voice hoarse yet filled with emotion. "After years of teaching, the wave of budget cuts hit. My school lost funding and I lost my job. That was already a blow. But then, my wife got sick. Medical bills. They swallowed everything. I sold our house, our belongings, and even then it wasn't enough. When she passed, it felt like the ground disappeared beneath me." Eleanor, sitting near Thomas, looked at Bennett with tears in her eyes. Even Agatha, who usually maintained an air of severity, seemed touched. "I tried to start over," Bennett continued, "but no one wanted to hire an old man with debts and nothing to offer. I ended up on the streets, and after a while you stop trying, because the world stops believing in you." Harrison felt a knot in his throat. He could clearly see how this could have been his life. If it weren't for the factory that had given him an opportunity at the right moment, if it weren't for Eleanor and Thomas, maybe he too would have fallen into the same spiral. The thought was overwhelming. "And you?" Bennett asked, looking directly at Harrison. "Did you follow the path you wanted?" Harrison hesitated before replying. "No," he finally said. "I wanted to be a teacher too, but my mother got sick, and I had to work to pay for her treatments. Then life happened, and the dream fell by the wayside." The two men exchanged a look that spoke more than words could express. It was a moment of mutual understanding, a recognition that both had made sacrifices that led them to very different but equally difficult places. "Maybe," Agatha interrupted the silence, "it's not too late for either of you." Harrison looked at his aunt, confused. "What do you mean?" "I have an old friend," she said, sitting in a nearby chair. "He runs a small cultural center in town. They need someone to help with reading and writing classes, especially for adults who never had the opportunity to study. It's a simple job, but it's a start, if you're willing." Harrison fell silent, absorbing her words. Eleanor placed her hand over his, smiling softly. "Harrison, maybe this is what you need," she said tenderly. Bennett, from the sofa, gave a weak smile. "Looks like someone is giving you a second chance, Wordsworth." Harrison smiled, despite the whirlwind in his mind. The possibility of a fresh start was daunting, but it also carried a thread of hope. He knew it would be a difficult path, but looking at his family and at Bennett, he realized he wasn't alone. As the fireplace crackled, casting warm shadows around the room, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, a glimpse of a future. The first rays of sunlight filtered through the heavy curtains of Agatha's house, bringing a sense of renewal as the morning progressed. The smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the air as Harrison sat at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a warm mug. It was the third day since they had arrived, and he was still trying to organize his thoughts and find a clear direction for his life. Bennett, now visibly stronger, entered the kitchen with slow but steady steps. He gave a slight wave to Harrison before sitting down at the opposite bench. "You look like you didn't sleep," he remarked with a tired smile. Harrison shook his head, gazing into the dark liquid in his mug. "I've been thinking a lot," he admitted. "About what you said. About starting over." "And what's the problem?" Bennett asked, grabbing a piece of toast that Eleanor had left on the table. "You have a chance. Not everyone is that lucky." Harrison sighed deeply, looking out the window. "The issue isn't having the chance, but what to do with it. What if I fail again? I've dragged my family all the way here. I don't know if I could bear disappointing them again." Bennett raised an eyebrow, chewing slowly before responding. "Harrison, if there's one thing I've learned over the years, it's that the biggest failure isn't trying and losing. It's never trying at all. Do you think your family wants you to give up?" At that moment, Eleanor entered the kitchen with Thomas chasing after her. The boy was holding a small leather-bound sketchbook, his face lit up with excitement. He ran over to Harrison, tugging at his sleeve. "Daddy, look what I found in the bedroom. It's Grandma Agatha's." "I'm not a grandma," Agatha corrected from the living room, though her tone was smiling. Harrison took the sketchbook from Thomas's hands. It was an old diary filled with notes and drawings, clearly a record of Agatha's early years as a teacher. He flipped through the pages, finding lesson plans and even thank-you letters from students. The familiarity of those scribbles brought a pang of nostalgia. "She was good at this," Bennett said, peering over Harrison's shoulder. "Maybe it's something that runs in the family." Harrison closed the sketchbook and set it aside. "I don't know if I still have it in me," he murmured. "You do," Eleanor stated firmly. "You always have. You just need to believe again." Before Harrison could respond, Agatha appeared in the kitchen doorway, looking animated. "I just spoke with my friend, Mr. Larkins. He can meet with you tomorrow afternoon at the community center to discuss the assistant teacher position. He said he's looking forward to meeting you." Harrison felt his stomach churn. The idea of putting himself in such a vulnerable position again was terrifying. "Tomorrow?" he asked, trying to hide his anxiety. "That's quick." "Well, opportunities don't wait for anyone," Agatha replied, crossing her arms. "Are you going or not?" Eleanor placed her hand over his, conveying silent support. "You should go, Harrison. For us. For you." The following afternoon arrived faster than Harrison would have liked. He was in his room, looking in the mirror, adjusting a tie that seemed reluctant to cooperate. Insecurity washed over him. Each adjustment, each glance at his reflection only made the doubts grow. What if he wasn't good enough? What if this was just another failed attempt? Bennett knocked on the door and entered without waiting for permission, carrying a small leather case in his hands. "You look like someone going to a funeral," he joked with a crooked smile. "Here, this might help." He handed the case to Harrison, who opened it to find an elegant, clearly old pen with an inscription engraved, "Inspire and be inspired." Asterisk. "It was mine," Bennett explained. "I used it to grade papers, thought it might bring you luck." Harrison stared at the pen for a few seconds before carefully closing it and placing it in his pocket. "Thank you," he said with a nod. "I'll give it a shot." "Not just give it a shot," Bennett corrected. "You will do it, no matter what happens." In the car, as Eleanor drove him to the community center, the silence was heavy. Thomas, in the back seat, held a small children's book, turning the pages slowly. When they arrived at their destination, he leaned forward, handing the book to Bennett, who was sitting next to him. "Can you sign this for me, Mr. Bennett?" Thomas asked with a shy smile. Bennett looked at the boy, surprised, and then at Harrison, who merely shrugged. "I don't know why you want this," he said, opening the book, "but okay." He signed on the opening page, writing a small message before handing the book back to Thomas. The boy read the dedication aloud. For Thomas, never stop believing in the power of words. Harrison, sitting in front, felt a tightness in his chest upon hearing Bennett's words. He looked back and met the gaze of his former teacher. There was no need for words. They both knew that the gesture meant more than it appeared. When the car stopped in front of the community center, Harrison took a deep breath and stepped out, feeling the cold wind hit his face. He looked at the simple yet welcoming building, with people entering and exiting, carrying books and folders. It was a new beginning, and despite his fear, he knew he needed to take the first step. Inside the car, Eleanor squeezed Thomas's hand and said, "We're here together, and we will get through this." As she looked at Harrison entering the building, a mix of hope and determination illuminated her face. Inside the community center, Harrison felt the weight of his doubts beginning to lift, replaced by something stronger, a small but powerful spark of confidence. It was the beginning of something new. and he was finally ready to embrace what the future held for him. The clock struck 7 a.m. when Harrison got up, facing the new reality that awaited him that day. The sunlight streamed through the curtains of Agatha's small house, warming the space with an almost symbolic energy, as if even the weather were conspiring for everything to go right. He put on his best shirt, adjusted his tie, and took one last look in the mirror. Nervousness made his stomach churn, but something stronger surged within him: determination. In the kitchen, Eleanor was brewing a strong coffee while Thomas chewed on a slice of bread, swinging his legs excitedly in his chair. "You're going to crush it, Dad," the boy said with a beaming smile filled with confidence. "Yeah, Dad, you always do great," Eleanor chimed in with an encouraging wink. Harrison responded with a shy smile, but the warmth of his wife's and son's words was already easing his tension a bit. Bennett sat at the table, dressed more neatly than usual. He had decided that this day would mark a new chapter for him as well. The night before, he learned he'd been accepted into a social reintegration program for former teachers, something that could help him regain his dignity and perhaps even return to teaching, even if only as a volunteer. "Today is a good day for new beginnings," he said, lifting his coffee mug in a gesture of toast. Agatha appeared in the doorway, leaning slightly on a cane but maintaining the same firm demeanor as always. "Harrison, everything will go well. Remember who you are and what you can do," she said. Despite her usual seriousness, there was a tenderness in her gaze. "Thank you, Aunt," Harrison replied, genuinely grateful. He knew that without her, this opportunity might never have arisen. Shortly after, Harrison and Bennett left together in Eleanor's car. The community center wasn't far, but the drive was silent, heavy with the anticipation of what lay ahead. Bennett gazed out the window, lost in thought, while Harrison kept his eyes fixed on the road. "You're going to do great, Harrison," Bennett suddenly said, breaking the silence. "Remember why you started. This isn't just about a job, it's about inspiring people, just as you were inspired." Harrison glanced at him and nodded. Bennett's words resonated deeply in his mind. He parked the car in front of the simple but welcoming community center. The place buzzed with life. Young people carrying backpacks, elderly folks sitting on benches chatting animatedly. Harrison took a deep breath before getting out of the car. "I'll wait here," Bennett said, leaning back in the passenger seat. "I want to know how it goes." Harrison stepped inside the building, feeling his legs tremble slightly as he walked to the reception desk. He was greeted by a kind woman who led him to a room where the center's director, Mr. Larkins, awaited him. Larkins was a middle-aged man with warm eyes and a welcoming smile. "Ah, you must be Harrison Chapman," Larkins said, extending his hand. "I've heard good things about you from Agatha. She's an impressive woman." "She is," Harrison agreed, shaking the man's hand. They sat down, and the interview began. The questions were direct but not intimidating, about his experience, his motivations, and how he viewed education as a tool for social transformation. Harrison answered honestly, sharing his youthful dreams, life experience, and how he always believed in the power of reading and writing to change lives. "And why did you decide to return to this path now?" Larkins asked, leaning slightly forward. Harrison hesitated for a moment but then said, "Because I realized it's never too late to try. And because I want my son to see that it's possible to start over, no matter what happens." Larkins smiled and jotted down notes in his notebook. "I think you have exactly what we're looking for. We'll start you with a trial phase. You'll assist in reading and writing classes for elderly people and young people who never had the chance to study. What do you think?" Harrison could hardly believe what he had just heard. I think that's great," he replied, trying to contain his emotions. He reached out his hand to Larkins again, and the firm handshake confirmed that the opportunity was real. When he left the building, Harrison's heart felt lighter than it had in years. He saw Bennett sitting in the car, looking at him with anticipation. As he got into the vehicle, Harrison beamed widely. "I did it," he said. Bennett gave him a light pat on the shoulder. "I knew you would, Wordsworth." The drive back to Agatha's house was filled with laughter and reflections. When they arrived, Eleanor and Thomas ran to the door, eager for news. Harrison's smile was all they needed to know that things had gone well. "I knew it, Dad!" Thomas exclaimed, hugging his father tightly. "I knew it too," Eleanor added, wrapping her arms around him. "I'm so proud of you." The celebration was simple but full of emotion. Agatha brewed some hot tea, and everyone gathered around the table to share stories and dreams. Bennett, now more at ease, spoke about his own journey and the program that would help him start anew. "I wouldn't have made it this far without you all," he said, looking at each person at the table. "And Harrison, thank you for that blanket. It may seem like a small thing, but for me it was what saved my life." Harrison nodded, feeling emotional. "It wasn't just the blanket, Bennett. It was everything you taught me, even without knowing. You gave me a dream, and now I can finally chase it." At dawn, Harrison and Bennett stood in the yard, watching the sun rise. They exchanged a hug, a gesture sealing a deep connection, built not only through adversity but also through redemption and hope. Thomas appeared shortly after, holding the signed book. "Dad," he said with a shy smile, "are you going to teach other people like Mr. Bennett taught you?" Harrison knelt down, placing his hands on his son's shoulders. "Yes, son. I will do my best to teach and inspire, just like he did, because that's what matters, helping others believe they can be more." The message was clear. An act of compassion, no matter how simple, had the power to transform lives. And in that moment, with the family gathered and new horizons opening up, they all knew they were ready to start anew.
Sometimes, life puts us in front of challenges that seem insurmountable, but it's precisely in those moments that we discover strength and connections we never imagined. Harrison, Bennett, and the entire family showed us that even on the darkest days, simple acts of compassion can create extraordinary changes. This is the power of starting over, transforming pain into purpose, failure into learning, and fear into courage. Their story is not just about overcoming adversity, but about how helping others can bring us back to life. And you, have you ever thought about how a small gesture of yours could transform someone's world? What did you think of this emotional journey? Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Turn on the notification bell so you won't miss our upcoming videos, and leave a like to help us reach more people with these powerful messages. Let us know in the comments what touched you the most or what you would have done in Harrison's place. And of course, don't miss the next video recommended on the end screen. It's just as impactful as this one. Thank you for watching and being part of this journey. See you in the next video.